Welcome to True Mysteries. In today's video, we tell 3 stories of people lost at sea. Some survive, some don't. On November 23, 1942, a German U-boat sighted a British merchant vessel, the Ben Lomond, approximately 250 miles, 400 kilometers, off the coast of Brazil. The U-boat fired 2 torpedoes, both impacting the merchant vessel. On board was a 24-year-old Chinese cabin boy named Poon Lim. Lim immediately grabbed a life jacket, put it on, and jumped into the water just before the ship's boiler exploded. Within 2 minutes of impact, the Ben Lomond had sank, and Poon Lim was alone, floating in the Atlantic with no food or water. Poon Lim was a Chinese man who had taken a job on board the British ship to escape Hong Kong in 1941. Lim knew that an attack by the Japanese was imminent and knew that he did not want to be under Japanese rule. He left to accompany his brother as a cabin boy for the British. Lim had previously performed this work, but the treatment and the pay was poor. With the escalation of the war, the British needed more help, and they had increased their pay and improved treatment of the Chinese. Lim thought that this was at least better than being in Hong Kong when the Japanese took over. Now, the boat was sank and he was adrift at sea. After about 2 hours, Lim found a wooden raft that a crew member had launched from the ship but had not been able to climb into. The raft was wooden with a tarp for shade. The raft was also preloaded with provisions, including dried biscuits, 40 liters of water, a bag of sugar cubes, chocolate, 2 smoking pots, an electric torch, and flares. At this point, Lim expected to be rescued relatively soon. He rationed his food for 30 days, expecting that the British military would be searching for survivors, and it wouldn't be long before he was rescued. He also tied a rope to his wrist and the raft as a tether in case he fell overboard. Though he was a cabin boy on a merchant ship, he was a very poor swimmer, but still had his life jacket. He began surviving on his raft, living off of his provisions. As his time at sea became longer and longer, and his 30-day expectation became closer, he realized that he needed a more sustainable solution. He had to find ways to survive on the raft living off of the ocean. He fashioned a canopy and his life jacket to catch rainwater. He also made a fish hook from a spring in a flashlight. He used hemp rope to tie a fishing line. He would catch small fish and eat them raw. He would catch birds and lay them out, salting them with seawater to dry it out, making jerky. However, the blood from his catch would seep into the ocean and attract sharks. When there were no sharks, Lim would swim around the raft as best he could to keep his strength up. At one point, he drifted into a severe storm. He was able to survive this storm and stay on the raft. All of the hard work he had put in, catching fish, making jerky, and collecting water, was lost. He was now without food or water. He soon caught a bird, and being close to death, he drank the bird's blood. The bird's blood seeped into the sea, and just as before, attracted sharks. He had taken a nail from the raft and fashioned a hook and braided the rope to make it strong enough to catch large fish, or sharks. But this time, Lim was prepared. He baited the hook with a dead bird, wrapped his hands in canvas so he could grip the line without having rope burns, and dropped the bait into the water. A shark grabbed the bait and caught the hook. Lim pulled the shark onto the raft where the shark was still full of energy and fought back. Lim hit the shark over the head with a jug until the shark stopped moving. He then used a knife that he had fashioned from a biscuit tin to cut open the shark's belly and pull out its liver. He cut the liver open, sucking the blood from the liver for hydration. The shark kept him alive long enough for him to collect more water. He ate the shark meat and laid out the fins to dry. The dried fins reminded him a meal from his homeland. On several occasions, Lim was spotted in the ocean. On one occasion, an unidentified freighter saw him and was close enough to communicate. Lim shouted to the freighter in English, but the crew did not respond, and the freighter left him even though they saw him and must have heard him. One possible reason for not helping is that they may have thought he was a Japanese soldier and didn't want to deal with picking up a POW. Another possible reason is that Germans would place POWs on rafts posing as survivors, so ships would have to stop to pick them up, making them an easy target for a U-boat. On another occasion, a squadron of seaplanes passing over Lim saw him. They dropped a buoy so a rescue team could return and pick him up. But almost immediately after they left, a storm hit and Lim became separated from the buoy and could not be found again. He was also spotted once by a German U-boat, but they simply left him for dead. However, his luck would change on April 5, 1943, 133 days after the torpedo had hit the Ben Lomond and Lim's ordeal began. 3 fishermen were 10 miles, 16 kilometers off the coast of Brazil when they spotted a small dark object in the distance. As they approached, they saw a small wooden raft with Lim waving a shirt in the air. They picked him up and gave him food and water. He didn't speak Portuguese and they couldn't communicate, but they took him to Belém where he recovered in a hospital. In October 1943, he was taken to London where he was awarded a British Empire Medal by King George VI. He settled in the United States in 1944 and traveled the world teaching survival techniques. After 5 years of fighting to increase the Chinese immigration quota, he finally became a U.S. citizen. He lived until 1991. 133 days is still the record for surviving at sea on a raft. When Lim was told of his record, he stated, "I hope no one will ever have to break that record." On February 14, 2014, 7 Japanese women put on their scuba gear and entered the water off the coast of Nusa Penida, near Crystal Bay. These waters are part of the Coral Triangle located between the Pacific and Indian Oceans. The Coral Triangle is one of 8 major coral reef zones in the world and is recognized as a global center for marine biodiversity, known as the Amazon of the seas. The women were there to see underwater mangroves and ocean sunfish as well as other marine life. This is an extremely beautiful area for diving, and these divers had specifically planned their diving trip to this area. However, this area is also extremely dangerous for divers. The weather is known for quick rising storms, and the waters have sudden strong down currents. It is recommended for experienced divers only. And these women were experienced divers. The least experienced diver of the group still had over 50 dives, and 2 of the divers were dive instructors in the Coral Triangle. By all accounts, they were experienced and prepared for this dive. The 7 divers entered the water on Friday off the coast of Nusa Lembongan, just east of Bali. The weather was described by one of the divers, Saori Furikawa, a 37-year-old dive instructor, as serene. The water was flat, little to no wind, and the water was clear. It was a perfect day for diving. They descended into the water, and the dive boat captain followed the divers from his boat as he could clearly see the divers in the water. After only about 15 to 20 minutes in the water, a large storm hit and suddenly reduced visibility. The divers ascended as quickly yet as safely as possible. When they reached the surface, only 5 divers could be found. They held hands as the storm battered the divers. Furikawa later stated, "The surface of the sea started to spin like a washing machine, and all of us span around together, hand in hand." When they surfaced, Furikawa fired a flare to signal the dive boat, to no avail. The dive boat captain said that when the storm hit, the water immediately became cloudy and he could no longer see the divers. He searched for them, then headed to a buoy at a location that they all agreed they would meet at a specific time. He waited at the buoy and searched for over an hour before he radioed that the divers were missing and requested assistance. After the storm passed, the divers drifted in the water, clinging together in a tight group. They drifted for the entire first night, but throughout the night they would drink from passing coconuts. The storm had knocked coconuts off of the trees and washed them into the sea. The same storm that put them in this life or death situation was also keeping them alive. The next day, after being adrift for approximately 18 hours, they drifted to a large coral reef. They waited for rescue on the coral reef. At one point, they saw a passing tugboat, and the remaining instructor, Furikawa, dove into the water and tried to cut off the tug. But the current was too strong and swept her away from the tugboat, and away from the 4 other divers. She was swept further down the coast where she was able to grasp rocks on the shore. On Monday, 3 days after they went missing, a fisherman spotted the women clinging on to a large coral reef, 300 meters off the coast of Nusa Penida, 12 miles, 19 kilometers from where they had gone missing. A helicopter picked up Furikawa down the coast and dropped off food and water for the 4 women on the coral reef. A search and rescue boat picked up the remaining 4 missing women a little later. The search for the other 2 divers continued, and the body of 59-year-old Ritsuko Miyata was discovered by swimmers. Shoko Takahashi, age 35, was never found. The captain of the dive boat had stated that he had watched the divers for about 20 minutes before the storm hit, then searched for another hour before calling in that the divers were missing. However, the head of Bali's search and rescue, Didi Hamzar, told reporters that he had information suggesting that the captain had headed to shore to refuel before heading to the agreed-upon meeting spot. The captain, Augustinus Brata Kazuma, had indeed left the divers that day. After losing sight of the divers, he left the location to buy fuel, returning to the meeting spot 2 hours later. In a Bali court, he was convicted of negligence causing death and injury and was sentenced to serve 3 years in prison. As the verdict was read, he broke down in tears and stated to reporters, "I apologize to the families of the victims. It was not intentional." In 1813, a Japanese sailboat left the coast of Japan sailing to Edo, present-day Tokyo. The ship had a crew of approximately 17 and was captained by a man named Oguri Jukichi. They soon encountered a ferocious storm that disabled their ship, the Tokujomaru. Both the mast and the rudder were damaged and the ship was left adrift at sea. Initially, the crew survived off of the food and water, but that ran out quickly and they captured rainwater and ate soybean stores from the ship's hold. Over time, due to the lack of nutrients, the crew began suffering from scurvy, and as the days turned into months, crew members began dying. On March 24, 1815, the crew of the brig Forester spotted the Tokujomaru off the coast of California. They found 3 survivors, including the captain, Jukichi, and 2 other crew members, Otokichi and Hanbei, and 14 corpses on board the ship. Due to the language barrier, the reported crew size varied from 14 to 17 or 35. The rescue location was approximately 300 miles, 480 kilometers west-southwest of Point Conception. When the 3 survivors were brought ashore near present-day Santa Barbara, they were some of the first or the first documented Japanese to reach the California coast, which at the time was part of New Spain. They had drifted 5,000 miles and all agreed on the timeline of 484 days adrift, which is, to this day, in the Guinness Book of World Record for the longest time spent adrift at sea. The sailors were taken back to Japan by a Russian vessel, but Hanbei died along the way. Were honored by the Japanese government upon their return. I hope you enjoyed the stories. If so, please like, leave comments, and subscribe. Thanks for watching.